Welcome to Aptitude for Placements, and my name is Ranjit. I have conducted this aptitude training program at various engineering colleges all over India, and every year thousands of students get placed by attending this aptitude training program. Here you will find all the questions that are commonly encountered in most of the aptitude tests. These are the questions that keep on repeating in many of these tests. So just familiarize yourself with all these questions and you will have a clear advantage when you attempt your actual placement test. Let's start. 9 people are present in a room. 4 of them are Libyans, 3 of them are Chinese, and 2 are Portuguese. They are to be seated on 9 chairs, placed in a row and numbered from 1 to 9. The following rules are to be followed. The 4 Libyans should be seated together. So the 4 Libyans should be seated together. I'll just draw it like this. The 2 Portuguese must be seated together. So the 2 Portuguese should be together. The 3 Chinese may or may not be seated together. So Chinese may or may not be seated together. So let us start now. If a Libyan sits in chair number 6 and if a Chinese sits in chair number 8, then identify a chair which should be occupied by a Portuguese. So altogether 9 chairs are there. So I'll mark the 9 chairs like this. Now, as per the data given, if a Libyan sits in chair number 6, so in chair number 6 you have an L here, and if a Chinese sits in chair number 8, so here you have a C. Now, chair number 9 should also be occupied by a Chinese, because here you have a single chair. Now, that cannot be occupied by a P, because 2 P's should be together. Similarly, it cannot be an L, because the 4 L's should be together. Now, considering this arrangement, there are 2 possible arrangements for the L's. One arrangement for the L's is that they can be occupied by 3, 4, 5 and 6. And the other arrangement is it can be 4, 5, 6 and 7. So 2 arrangements are there. So I'll just mark one more arrangement. One possible arrangement for the L's is 3, 4, 5 and 6. Now the other arrangement is 4, 5, 6 and 7. And this is also L. Now these 2 arrangements are there. Now let us look at these 2 arrangements. Now the 2 P's should be together. So P cannot be here. So it has to be P and P here. And one Chinese is left out. So this will be filled with C. Now if you look at this arrangement, here you have 3 spaces. Now 2 of them will be filled with P's and the third space will be filled by a C. So 2 arrangements are there. P can be in 1 and 2 or in 2 and 3. So one arrangement is like this, P and C here. Now the other arrangement is C here and P here. So you can see in all these arrangements, in chair number 2 is always occupied by P. So identify a chair which should be occupied by a Portuguese, that is chair number 2. So in all the arrangements, chair number 2 is always occupied by a Portuguese. So chair number 2, option B. The Chinese will be seated together if a Portuguese is in which of the following chairs? I'll mark the 9 chairs like this. Now we'll go from the options. Now if a Portuguese is in chair number 1, so if you have a Portuguese here, now we'll have another Portuguese in 2, and then one possible arrangement is you can have one Chinese here, then the 4 else here, and then followed by the 2 Chinese. So it's not necessary that the 3 Chinese are together. So option A, 1 is wrong. So P can be in 1, it's not necessary that the 3 Chinese are together. Now let us look at option B, 3. Now if P is here, one possible arrangement is you can have P here, and then you can have a C here, followed by the else, and then 2C. So it is not necessary that the 3 Chinese are together. So option B, 3 is also wrong. Now let us try option C, 5. Now P is in 5. Now 2 possible arrangements are there for P's. So it can be P and P like this, or it can be P and P like this. Now in this case, here you have 4 spaces. These 4 will be occupied by the else, and the 3 Chinese will be together. Now here there are, if it is like this, there are 4 spaces here that will be occupied by the else, and these 3 will be occupied by the Chinese. So if P is in 5, it can be like this or like this. In both the cases, you can see that the 3 Chinese are seated together, here as well as here. So if P is in 5, the 3 Chinese will be seated together. So option C, 5 is the right answer. If chair number 2 is occupied by a Chinese and chair number 3 is occupied by a Portuguese, identify a chair which can be occupied by a Chinese. I'll mark the 9 chairs like this. Chair number 2 is occupied by a Chinese and chair number 3 is occupied by a Portuguese. Now we'll just make one more arrangement. So chair number 2 is occupied by Chinese and chair number 3 is occupied by Portuguese. Now here you have only one chair. So here there is only one chair. So that definitely has to be occupied by a Chinese. Now in both the arrangements, this has to be P because the 2 P's should be together. Now we are left with 4 L's and 1 C. So one possible arrangement is we can have L here and C here, or we can have C here and then the 4 L's here. So these are the 2 possible arrangements. Identify a chair which can be occupied by a Chinese. Look at option A, 4. Now 4 will always be occupied by Portuguese. So it cannot be occupied by Chinese. So A is wrong. Look at 6. 6 is occupied by L, so not C. Then 7 is occupied by L, not possible. 8 is also occupied by L. Correct answer is option E, 9. Chair number 9 can be occupied by a Chinese. If this is the arrangement, it is possible. So the correct answer is option E, 9. If none of the Chinese are next to each other, identify a chair which cannot be occupied by a Portuguese. So I'll mark the 9 chairs like this. Now the Chinese are not next to each other. So one possible arrangement is I can have C here, followed by the 2 P's, then a C here, then the 4 L's, and then a C here. So this is one possible arrangement. The other arrangement is I can have a C here, followed by the 4 L's, followed by a C and then the 2 P's and then a C. Now these are the only 2 possible arrangements where the Chinese are not next to each other. You can see the Chinese are all separated. So only these 2 arrangements are there. Now we need to identify a chair which cannot be occupied by a Portuguese. Now look at option A, 2. So 2 can be occupied by a Portuguese. So option A is wrong. 3 can be occupied by a Portuguese, so B is also wrong. Now look at 5. 5 cannot be occupied by a Portuguese. It is always occupied by an L. So C is the right answer. Now let us eliminate the other options. 7. 7 can be occupied by Portuguese, so that is wrong. 8 can be occupied by Portuguese, so that is also wrong. So the chair which cannot be occupied by a Portuguese is chair number 5, that is option C. If chair number 1 and chair number 7 are occupied by people of the same nationality, identify a chair that must be occupied by a Libyan. I will mark the 9 chairs like this. Chair number 1 and chair number 7 should be occupied by people of the same nationality. So compulsorily it has to be Chinese because only they can be separated. So chair number 1 should be occupied by Chinese. Chair number 7 should also be occupied by Chinese. Now here there are 2 spaces. So compulsorily these 2 spaces should be occupied by P. Here altogether 5 spaces are there. 4 of them will be occupied by Ls and 1 will be occupied by a C. Now there are 2 possible arrangements. One arrangement is I can have a C here followed by the 4 Ls, or I can have the 4 Ls like this followed by a C. Now these 2 arrangements are possible. Now identify a chair that must be occupied by a Libyan. Compulsorily it has to be a Libyan. Look at option A1. Not necessarily. It need not be occupied by a Libyan. So A is wrong. Look at option B2. 2 may be occupied by a Libyan, may not be. So option B2 is also wrong. Now 4 compulsorily has to be occupied by a Libyan. So C is the right answer. If you look at 6, it may or may not be occupied by a Libyan. 8 again not necessarily. It may be occupied by a Portuguese. So the correct answer is option C, 4. Let me briefly explain how to prepare for your aptitude test. First of all, you need to familiarize yourself with all the questions that have been worked out here. These are the questions that keep on repeating in many of the aptitude tests. After that, you need to attempt practice tests. According to me, you need to attempt at least 10 practice tests before your actual placement test. Here, I will be giving you 10 practice tests, and these practice tests will be ideal for you to improve your test scores. The 10 practice tests are available at a cost of only Rs 200. So all that you need to do is make a payment of Rs 200 either through Google Pay or through PhonePe or through Paytm, and you will receive the 10 practice tests. The details of the payment comes next.